Greetings. Coming up next is the Talking Socialism show, featuring our host there, J.B. Christensen, and myself, John Case, and of course our regular attender, Mike Diesel. And we're going to have as guest today Dr. Ray Smock, a former historian of the House of Representatives, and also the director of the Byrd Center, which he co-founded with Senator Byrd, of course. And he's an expert on both the Constitution and the history of the House of Representatives, and we're going to get him to comment on what, if any, changes in the Constitution and other changes we may need to escape the situation we're in now. In addition to that, we're going to have Dan Doyle, who's a vice president of the American Federation of Government Employees, and for the districts that include the state of West Virginia, and I think North Carolina and Virginia, maybe Maryland too. And he's going to be talking about the situations that public workers are facing in the current environment. So it's going to be an interesting show coming right up. This is the May 1st, May Day show of Talkin' Socialism. Okay. 3, 2,
Ready for
1.
the intro?
Yes, Mike, do us an intro.
Good morning and welcome to Talking Socialism. It's a Friday show here with our dusty-footed philosopher and host, Mr. John Case, and his sidekick, JB, along with the incredibly smart and intelligent, and we have no idea why the hell he's here with us, is Ray Smock, everybody. It's me.
Hey,
Hi, I'm the announcer guy.
Mike Diesel, it's not just an
By the way, it's May 1st and it's Friday.
It's May 1st and it's Friday. So happy May Day, everybody. It's in my book, it's International Labor Day, Workers' Day. So, and I will sometime today, remember the Haymarket Martyrs, which died for the 8-hour day. I should have played Pete Seeger's 8-hour day. 8 hours we'd have for work and 8 hours we'd have for play. 8 hours we'd have for pleasure and free America. So he used to sing that on Picking Lines. Okay, so welcome on May Day to the Talking Socialism show. I think JB and I agreed on naming it this because after spending months with Bernie's campaign and after spending decades with various circumstances in which Talking Socialism was just a very small affair on the fringes of everything. But now that we've had the pancaking economy, the pancaking pandemic, the pandemics inside the pandemic, if you talk to the addiction folks up in Martinsburg, and we're sitting there looking at a chasm as big as the one that greeted us in 1929 to 32. And of course, the response of the Roosevelt administration was some more socialism. Not as much as some other people got, but we definitely had a bunch of it, in the mobilization for the war and in the various programs designed to increase the size of the federal government and the size of the number of people being just basically employed in public works to help cure the Depression, since there really was not a cyclical repair to the Great Depression. All the Roosevelt programs did not fix it. The mobilization for World War II did. His programs they helped people, but they did not change the basic direction of the economy. So we're facing that again, and that's the motivation for having a Talking Socialism show, talk about how much we need. And this morning we have, but the other thing that comes up in this unbelievable political mess that's been going on since Trump got elected, and even more so since this crisis initiated, is and a question I wanted to ask Ray about. I know he's very knowledgeable about this. Former historian for the U.S. House of Representatives and a director of the Byrd Center here in Shepherdstown for many years. You're retired now, I believe, aren't you?
That's right.
And by the way, I may have referred to you as doctor because you're at a college, but are you a PhD? My wife is a PhD, and she's a little touchy about this, So,
Well, I'm a PhD, but I'm not touchy about it.
Okay, all right. So, Dr. Ray Smock, my question is, how much socialism we're going to need to get out of this? And the other question I sent to him in an email was, does the Constitution need to be changed? And if so, where? And I'm going to ask Ray to open up here. Ray.
Well, I don't think the Constitution needs to be changed. As in matters of politics, it's always the will of the people, the will of those in power to make things happen. And I don't see anything in the Constitution that would have to be changed in order for us to make it work the way it has the power to work if we wanted to. So I don't know. There's always since the Constitution was drafted, there have been over the last couple hundred years more than 16,000 amendments put forward. and of course, not very many of them have ever passed. And of course, one of the ones that you hear about all the time, and it still comes up, somebody dumps it in the hopper every year and they have to consider it. It usually goes to a committee and just dies there. And that is a balanced budget amendment. You hear all this talk about the balanced budget amendment. Can you imagine where we would be right now if the Constitution had a balanced budget amendment in it, where we could not go into deficit spending to stop a pandemic, to stop the crisis of everybody being out of work? And we'd say, oh, well, everybody's just going to have to starve to death. We're not going to be able to do anything because we have a constitutional amendment and we can't violate our Constitution.
Right. So
that would be the silliest thing in the world. The only way we're going to get out of this mess is to have the federal government spend money like they never have spent it before. And if it takes us 100 years to pay it back, that's what. So, and the government has the power to do that now without any constitutional amendment. The states, on the other hand, they do have constitutional provisions that require a balanced budget. So they're limited. And in the case of an emergency, it's up to the federal government to step in and do what's necessary to help the states. Of course, now we got this fight going on that Donald Trump doesn't want to help the states unless they act nice to him. So that's a human problem, the failure of leadership, not the failure of the Constitution.
All right. So what about the Equal Rights Amendment?
Well, the Equal Rights Amendment is back in the news. And of course that has to do with fundamental human rights, and it should have been passed originally. I don't know if anybody's seeing this new series that's on Hulu. It's a remarkable series called Mrs. America, and it's the story of Phyllis Schlafly. Yep. And how she almost single-handedly, not single-handedly in the end, but how she led the fight against the passage of ERA and managed to defeat it when it came up before. But this Hulu series is really pretty good. It takes the feminists. You see this feminist group in New York, Betty Friedan, and they're pitted against Phyllis Schlafly, who's played by Kate Blanchett, and boy, does she nail it! I knew Phyllis Schlafly.
Really?
She was appointed by Ronald Reagan to a commission on the bicentennial of the Constitution, and I was the chief guy for the House of Representatives for that event. So I was in on all those meetings and saw her in action. That was long afterwards. But that's another story. But the ERA is now working its way back again. I don't know if it has a chance. I think the country's ready for it more than ever. And whether it can get enough states, some of the states that ratified it before have rescinded that. So exactly where it stands politically is very murky right now.
What about well, I'm thinking about on the Constitution, the balance of powers between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. I mean, are we stretching that? That seems to be
well, for the longest time now, we've had dysfunctional government, and you can always say, if you're going to be fair and balanced, And also, if you don't want to exercise your mind, you're going to say, well, this is the fault of both parties, you know. So you have to share the blame it around. I think that's malarkey. The Republican Party is primarily at fault, and that's not my opinion. A lot of the scholars have looked at that. Some of the top people like Norm Ornstein and Tom Mann, who've written books about that, and they're among the best scholars of Congress there is. And they say, let's face it, this is not an equal share in the load. The Republican Party has wanted to shrink government. They have wanted to take Grover Norquist's idea, who's the great. He has this organization that keeps everybody from passing taxes,
right,
or increasing taxes. Norquist was the one that said, we want to get the federal government small enough so we can drown it in a bathtub.
right.
Well, that's exactly the opposite of where we need to be right now. We need a federal government that's exercising all of its powers under the Constitution, and any party that wants to limit the use of the federal government in this crisis is just plain wrong.
All right, so
I completely
go ahead,
agree
Mike.
I completely agree with that. I think also too, in many aspects of it's such a clown show for the last 3 years. But it's also been kind of look over here, you know, because a lot of times you can't pay attention all the time to what he says and what's coming out as what they think, because you got to pay attention to what they're doing. They're slicing everything. They're cutting everything. You know, look at the EPA. It's the Justice Department is now his. Like, you know, you're looking at them taking over intelligence agencies and shrinking them. They don't care. They just cut. And now we're hitting the face with this thing, and all of the people who were qualified to work on this, presenting facts, who cares? He cuts those. He either fires those people, or he gets somebody to manipulate them. I mean, it is unconscionable. You actually are, to my knowledge, this administration, and I'm going to say this, and you guys don't have to agree with me, but I think they're guilty of genocide. I think because think about how many things that Obama put in place and gave him a workbook to work from for a pandemic, and he just, I'm not looking at that. And he cut everything. Center for Disease Control, all of the official scientists and epidemiologists and people that were out. We had folks in China, and all of that was shut down.
Right.
For what reason? Now you're looking at the results of it. People are dying. There is almost 65,000 Americans dead because of asshole.
Now.
I'm sorry. I don't want to be vulgar, but the man is an idiot.
That's
okay. He's a bloviating
he has
moron.
He has no idea how to run. He doesn't fill positions that are empty. There's no supervisory skills in just about any agency. Everybody's an acting head, you know, so they can be replaced at a moment's notice. I mean, we've never seen anything like this.
Okay, so my next question really for all of you is that suppose the Democrat, hopefully Biden survives, gets elected, should the Trumpers be charged with crimes?
Yes. Yes.
Is that part of what has to happen?
Yes.
Okay, I heard you got okay. Anybody else on that?
We got you loud and clear, Mike.
Okay.
Anybody else on that one?
Are you who are you saying should be charged with crimes?
Let's start with the president.
I think the president's going to be charged with a number of crimes that not necessarily related to the pandemic, because he's operated his presidency as a criminal enterprise.
Exactly.
And there's ample evidence of that. And I think one of the things we got to watch when he does leave office is he's going to be destroying an awful lot of records, a lot more than Ollie North destroyed when in Iran-Contra in the basement of the White House when he was running shredders overtime. So there's going to be a big cover-up. But I think that a lot of people in this administration are going to have to be held accountable, and mostly it's going to be people who are directly related to the president, including members of his own family, who I think are up to their necks in emoluments violations and feathering their own nest while they're in office. So that doesn't relate directly to the pandemic. What we've got is elections have consequences, and the American people, for a million different reasons, and I'm not one of those that goes around saying that anybody that voted for Donald Trump is an idiot. I think you have to learn from your mistakes. However, there's a lot of reasons why a lot of people didn't like Hillary Clinton, a lot of the things going on in that election. And when you have a binary system and about half the people are going to vote their party affiliation, the other half are going to vote their party affiliation, it's always going to get down to a close election. That's the nature of the beast. But in the case of Trump, that election was a terrible mistake. We elected the worst qualified person in America, not the best qualified or even close to being qualified, but simply the worst. I mean, the guy was nuts to begin with, and he was self-centered and had no leadership qualities and doesn't even read the presidential briefings about the pandemic. There's ample evidence that he just didn't pay any attention, and yet he's where the buck's supposed to stop. He's supposed to be the decision maker, and he didn't make decisions that started the government in action.
He looked bored the other day when Fauci was explaining the positive aspects of the two drugs, right, Mike? And but he was sitting there, and they had him in the camera, but he looked bored to death.
He was missing Fox and Friends.
Yeah, when does the cartoon start?
Anytime anybody else speaks and he's in the room, it takes away attention from him. And that all malignant narcissists need to be the center of attention and power all the time.
Have we ever indicted an ex-president before?
No. No, in fact, of course, the only one that left under a terrible cloud of constitutional violations, it was Richard Nixon, and Gerald Ford pardoned him. And that was very controversial at the time. But I think some people understood that, this was trying to put something behind us. I'm not sure we should have put it behind us. We should have examined it. But then that made Jerry Ford a one-term president. I mean, no one quite ever forgave him for that one single act of pardoning Nixon.
That's true. I remember that. That's true. I read a speech. That was an interview, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. This is in a different context. It was with the current Chinese president, Xi Jinping. And he was criticizing the Russians for criminalizing Stalin. And as an example, he used a huge constituency in China who wanted to criminalize Mao Zedong for the disaster of the Cultural Revolution and the stealing your backyard, and lots of people starved to death. And Mao came from mostly a peasant background. Certainly that was his backing. And he didn't really know much about development. He was making it up as he went along, wrapping in a bunch of rhetoric, but really just making it up as they went along. And a huge disaster happened. And there was a big movement to try and criminalize that activity. But Xi Jinping had an interesting notion. He said, if you criminalize, your own nation, then you may find afterwards that you are unable to ever unite it again. And it was just an aphorism in a way, but it does speak to, how profound. I mean, for example, Lincoln did not want to, criminalize. He did not put Lee in jail. Okay, he did not put. I don't know what happened to Jefferson Davis. I can't remember what his fate was, but And out of a sense that, you know, you just had a warfare, you had a civil warfare, you had a huge civil conflict, and you want to get out of it as still one country, which is not a guaranteed thing in life. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, you put your finger on it, John. That was a very, very good. Who is responsible? If we, the people, are the power in this country, maybe we criticize our leaders for being short, of, you know, a lot of ways, but maybe we are as citizens too. And if we have an election, and even though there were all kinds of peculiarities in that election and Russian interference that we still don't know fully about, if we accept the election, which we should under the Constitution, then we have to live with the consequences until we can change it. And if we don't do that, if we say, "Oh, we made a mistake, and let's either take to the streets or cause a revolution or something," well, then we do undermine the legitimacy of government, the legitimacy of the Constitution. And so we have to suffer even an imbecile like Donald Trump as our president, because he was, as far as we can tell, duly elected. And everybody went to his inauguration, and Obama was there, and Hillary was there, and they all put on their game face. They didn't do it for Donald Trump. They did it for the Constitution and for the respect of the electorate. So we do have to keep that in mind. So, and then in 2018, we saw that the country was already revolting against Donald Trump, and they made a substantial election in the House of Representatives. That was our first chance, the off-term election. And in that election, Donald Trump lost big time and reached that change. But the Senate, most of them are still in control of Trump's party. The impeachment failed, but that still didn't mean that efforts weren't being made under the Constitution to put a serious check and maybe even remove Donald Trump from office. We tried that. Our next chance comes in about, 108 days?
Yeah, is that what it is exactly? I'm glad you're keeping track.
Or 107 or whatever. I'm not Brian Williams on MSNBC who tells us every day how long the Trump administration has gone on.
May I say a few things?
Yeah, go ahead, Mike. Yeah, sorry.
First and foremost, I just want to also, I know I said I wasn't going to curse again, but I do want to quote one of our former presidents, W., who after the inauguration turned to Michelle Obama after the speech and said, "Well, that was some weird shit."
That sounds good, George.
Let's also keep that in mind, and let's keep in mind too is the fiddling with the elections, the IDs, the voter ID bullshit that it seems to permeate Wisconsin, and it was permeating Pennsylvania. You had somebody on the record saying, if we get this ID thing passed, of course, Republicans are going to take over. And now I commend the House of Representatives and Nancy Pelosi for pushing a voter mailed-in election, for pushing it and saying we can do this. We can do this. We can do a mail-in election where you mail in your vote, because we've already seen what happened. I mean, Wisconsin has another special election coming up, and they still don't have social distancing for this election. There's a special election coming up. I'm not quite. I think this week, and they're forcing and they've already had people die from voting in the last election. I mean, is this the way we're going to do things?
Apparently.
We have to consider that, but also too, we have to look at the fact that he only won by what? Not quite 100,000 votes.
Yeah, in the right places. And,
right. Well, he lost the popular vote by 3 million.
Yeah, and even in the Electoral College, which the president keeps saying was a huge victory, it was a squeaker.
Yeah.
This was one of the perhaps one of the closest elections in in our history. I mean, there was no mandate, and Trump made it one, but it was a squeaker, and so yeah, it's time for us to correct, if we have any sense at all as a country, given all we're going through and all we've seen from this president. I don't care if you're a Republican, a Democrat, independent, or whatever. This is a time when we need major change, and I think it's going to happen. I think the signs are there. We saw it in 2018, but it's key not only that we get rid of Donald Trump as president, but that the Senate has to go into Democratic hands. And I don't see the Democrats as necessarily a panacea. They're not going to be the saviors. They're going to have their problems and their difficulties too. But it's time for the Democrats to have control, simply because the Republicans have botched it so badly, and we are in the worst condition now than we have ever been. The worst pandemic in 100 years that we have not been able to deal with effectively as other parts of the world that aren't as equipped as we are. And then the political disaster of how Trump has hollowed out the federal government just at the time we need the best expertise in all areas.
Yeah, I think that's going to be I think that's going to bring him down, actually. But, you know, sometimes there are structural problems. I'll go back to the Civil War, not because I think we're going to repeat it. I'm not, even though there are some legacy issues, of course. But there are times when you get into your institutions become married to economic structures that are not sustainable. And when the economy and when the economic foundation of those things starts to fall apart, you find that your public institutions, which tended to wrap around them or adapt to them, that they just fail. And so, and when that happens, you do sometimes have to go through, sometimes you can't do, even though economic change, let me just say this, is almost always incremental. No matter what someone's program is, economies do not change all at once, okay? And if you try to do it all at once, they'll just fall right to the floor on you, okay? So, but public policy is different. And it actually kind of accords to a kind of power law instead of the normal distribution, where you get very big swings potentially in how institutions are set up to deal with things. And it has a lot to do with historical culture. And well, this happened in the Civil War, where the institution of slavery and two huge social classes, you know, slave owners and enslaved, were abolished. In the end, they ceased to exist. You know, and slavery at the time was the biggest source of wealth, I believe, in the country, the slaves themselves, before the Civil War. So we now have a situation where I think we have the levels of inequality and the political corruption at very high income levels is such that I think we do need to have a restructuring of our many of our public institutions. And I'm not sure how that happens until they just plain fail, which is what happened prior to the Civil War, all right? You couldn't govern in that way anymore. You couldn't handle the addition of the Western states. You couldn't handle the fugitive slaves. You couldn't handle relationships at the borders. And it became just impossible. I fear that that is one possible direction we're headed now. That's my fear. I mean, I think that's a lot of people's fear, that it's out of control, that it's not going to be, that the Democrats may win, but the problems may, I mean, there's considerable divisions among Democrats about a lot of things. And I'm just wondering how far we have to fall before everybody decides, oh my God, we got to get up and do this ourselves. I think about West Virginia. No one's coming over the hill to save us. And we don't have much wealth except coal and gas. That's it.
And our governor would never make it over the hill. So,
you know, where do we go? Okay. So it's, you know, even though I hate this, I'm going to go backwards now and say, well, I'm not sure even though it's costly to national unity, I'm not sure that some people don't have to be put in jail. So, and you don't have to. So you got to establish, in a way, a different kind of dictatorship, perhaps. Okay, I'm going to say that word to get you over the hump somewhere. I mean, this happened in the middle of the Civil War, and it's happened in the American Revolution, and it's happened sometimes in other countries, in England several times. I see upheaval ahead. Any reactions, guys?
Well, we're certainly in a state of upheaval already on a massive scale, and that was going on politically even before the pandemic. But this pandemic is got everybody focused in a way that we never had to really focus about our own existence. This is existential threat. And it's one that is not an academic thing that you just talk about. The word existential is even kind of abstract for a lot of people. What does it mean? Well, it means it affects you, buddy. It affects everybody. And that's what existential means. And this is an existential threat. It affects your job. It affects your livelihood. It affects your school kid, your kids' education. You can't even send them to school. It affects all of our institutions. It affects our medical supply lines and our medical health, public health. It shows that if you don't have insurance for medical care, you're dead in the water in a crisis like this. So it has, I think, laser-focused people about the need to do something different. And I think even if we didn't have a revolution, if we had good government, for a while, and people saw the effects of good government, and by good government I mean people who are sane and who understand that the purpose of government is to serve the people, not for the people to serve the government, or not for the people to suck up to some king. Trump thinks he's a king. So we got to reverse that. And I think that I didn't come on today to promote Joe Biden's election, but somebody like Joe Biden understands good government. He understands bringing good people. He understands beefing up all of these agencies. And then, since this is an hour to talk about socialism, we're going to have to keep spending money like there's no tomorrow. And whether it's Democrats or Republicans, the Republicans are spending it now. The trouble is that most of it's going to corporations. It's not going to somebody that's working in a meat plant.
Right.
I mean, these guys are being told to go to work without any kind of protection whatsoever, just to keep hamburgers on our table. That doesn't make sense unless they're protected. And so that's something that Democrats seem to understand better than the current administration.
For sure. I see we had Dan Doyle trying to connect in. I think he's going to reconnect. It looks like he was.
I think he was having a little bit of problem with the audio.
Okay. Anyway, so
I wanted to also point out Glenn Kirshner, who I absolutely love and admire, former district attorney, and he says something very smart, along with Elizabeth Warren, who has indicated this, that as we were talking before, after this is over, and hopefully by hook or by crook, one way or another, he's out of office, there needs to be a Trump crimes tribunal. There needs to be and Glenn could probably head that up because of all of his experience on both sides of the aisle and working for different administrations. He's got a lot of experience, and I think he's the guy for the job. I think he
Truth Commission,
like a special prosecutor, newly minted vice president, soon to be president, hopefully Joe Biden will announce a special prosecutor to say, look, you guys have to be looked into because of the crap that went on with regards to his impeachment and all of those people being influenced, and then all of a sudden all of it reaching the light of day. He was trying to make a deal with a foreign government for dirt on an opponent.
Well, he should.
I understand that it wasn't successful in terms of the wimpy ass Republican senators, I get that. I understand that they all went in lockstep with him. But you know what? Some of you guys are going down too.
Dan, can you hear me? Is your mic working? Is the mic?
Yes, I can. Good morning, everybody.
Hold on
Good
a
morning,
second.
Dan.
Morning.
Morning.
JB, you want to introduce Dan here to our little conversation?
Yes, it'd be my pleasure to introduce Dan Doyle. He's president of the American Federation of Government Employees here in West Virginia and a prominent member of the executive board of the West Virginia AFL-CIO and longtime friend and just one of the nicest people you'll ever meet.
God bless you, John. Thank you, sir.
I mean, every time we have the labor reception in Charleston, he's surrounded by admirers. I mean, the guy he's one of the nicest people I've ever met.
Well, one of your admirers
up here.
One of your admirers is my wife, who's a member of your union. Okay, so.
Oh, fantastic, John. Which local does she belong to?
Whatever the one that's in the National Science Foundation. I'm not sure the number, but.
Okay, yeah. So as John was saying, I'm the national vice president for AFGE's District 4, and District 4 covers West Virginia, Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina, all of the AFGE locals. We've got about 65 locals, about 30,000 members in those AFGE locals throughout those 4 states, and pretty much any federal agency that can have a union in it, we're in there fighting for them. In West Virginia, in particular, we've got several VA locals, several Bureau of Prison locals, Department of Energy, Mine Safety and Health Administration, Social Security Administration, NIOSH, so on and so forth. So we're all over the place.
I'd also like to introduce Dan to Ray Smock, who has been with us the first half hour. Ray used to be the historian for the United States House of Representatives for many
fantastic,
years.
Ray. Very nice to meet you, sir.
You, Dan.
And he's also been set up the Byrd Center, I believe. Or aren't you the founder of that center at Shepherd University?
Yes, I am. Although Senator Byrd is the one that founded it.
Of course, yes. I'm sorry.
Good federal money.
How could I possibly forget?
Yeah. In AFGE, we like to joke, there's a couple of Coast Guard units, Coast Guard Vessel Documentation Center over there in the Eastern Panhandle in Martinsburg. We like to joke that Senator Byrd was so powerful he brought the ocean to West Virginia.
That's right.
That's right. And we haven't had any shark attacks in West Virginia since Senator Byrd put that facility here.
Anyway, well, Dan, let me tell me, how are your members doing and in this mess? I know from my wife that she knew people, for example, that came over to the National Science Foundation from when the Department of Agriculture was notified they had to relocate to Kansas City.
Mm-hmm.
There would be no exceptions and no remote working.
We were hip deep in that fight. We were hip deep in that, just touching on that very briefly, the USDA, that relocation to Kansas City was nothing more than federal employee bashing. They were simply trying to get rid of some very valuable experts in the United States Department of Agriculture, long-term civil servants who take their jobs very seriously, and that was nothing but federal employee union bashing. You got people, especially it seems to be this administration and some of their ilk, who want to say that government can do nothing good for you, when we all know that's not true at all. There are dedicated federal employees. But I'm sorry for sidetracking. Back to your original question. It depends upon which agency and which facility you're talking about as to how they're doing. Some have been given telework, and like for instance, it took them about 3 or 4 weeks to finally get around to it, but Social Security Administration allowed all of their employees to telework. So they're all teleworking safely from home. You go to the other end of the spectrum, and you've got our Bureau of Prison Workers and our Veterans Affairs, people at the VA hospitals, people at Mine Safety and Health Administration, people at the Department of Defense civilian support for the different bases. We don't have any, obviously, here in West Virginia, but we have a number in District 4, especially down in the Norfolk and Hampton Roads area. Have quite a few down there. Those people are on the front lines, are working side by side with people and are being exposed every day. And quite frankly, the vast majority of them don't have the personal protective equipment that they need to have. They're being denied the right kind of masks, the right kind of equipment. It's just in some cases an absolutely, I can't think of anything other than unconscionable, bordering on criminal situation where the managers and other people would put these frontline people at such risk, and their families at risk too, because then you take it home.
Do the managers have masks?
It depends upon where you're at. So like if you go into the VA hospitals, for instance, you're finding the VA hospitals, they're being given those paper masks that everybody gets when you walk into a hospital. And they're being told, the nurses are being told, you got to use that mask for 1 full week and keep that mask for 1 full week. And then if you want to change that mask, you got to come to your manager and ask your manager, does this mask look dirty enough for me to change that out? There are people where there have been COVID, people tested positive for COVID who are supposed to be in isolation, who need to be transferred to an isolation ward, and the nurse of the day and the doctor on shift will both make that call, and a manager will come in and overrule that. Now, fortunately, that hasn't happened in West Virginia. These are cases I'm telling you about that have occurred in Virginia, in Roanoke, in Richmond, and places like that. West Virginia, our VAs, knock on wood, thankfully, have been very blessed. We're not seeing an outbreak of COVID in our VA hospitals so far in West Virginia.
How about
or in our prisons?
That is correct, John. Very good point, brother. That we're not seeing so far in our prison system. The inmates don't have any cases. A few staff have had spouses test positive, and so they've been privately quarantined at home until they're cleared to come back. But so PPE is a major issue. But another major concern we have is there's no widespread testing. The testing they're doing for people simply consists of, if you drive up to a VA facility, you want to go into the VA facility, they're gonna maybe take your temperature, but they might just ask you, how are you feeling today? And have you felt okay for the last couple of days? Here, wear this paper mask, you're good to go. I mean, we know there are studies that say that it's anywhere from 50 to a lot of reliable studies say as high as 80% of people who have COVID are asymptomatic, show no symptoms of it whatsoever. And so to ask somebody, how are you feeling today? And oh, may we take your temperature, just doesn't cut it. That's not a COVID test.
Yesterday, Dr. Aldous, day before yesterday, a local physician here is very active in this matter and very knowledgeable. He was saying that actually, and also the method of taking the test, that he watched a video of actually someone in West Virginia taking a test, and he looked at it and he says, that's not the correct method. And they were just going just inside the nose, right? Whereas you're supposed to go it's supposed to feel like you're getting your brain tickled a little bit.
Right. You've got to get back in the sinus cavity. That's why they've got that long swab that they're supposed to go in for the, the famous news conference when I don't like to say his name, was showing the Q-tip in one hand and the really long swab in the other hand. That was one of the few times where his science experiment was actually a little bit on spot.
Right. I saw you. I was just mentioning before when he was listening to Dr. Fauci talk about improvements in this therapeutic drug that's around. Trump looked bored. I mean, he wasn't talking.
I keep telling the truth, I'll get fired, but that's okay.
Yeah. Short attention span.
Yes,
well,
but anyway,
I think with our president, it's unfortunate that if he's not the one in the limelight, then he's not happy, and he obviously is no expert in these matters, and so he's not happy having a press conference if he can't be out there in front, and so that's unfortunate for all of us, because this is a very serious situation we're dealing with, very serious times, and it calls for very sober leadership. And sometimes a good leader knows when to step aside and let the experts do the talking. So I'll leave it at that.
Right.
Dan, hi, Mike.
Yeah, we're having problems.
Mike, how you doing, brother?
Nice to meet you. Dan, one of the things I pointed out earlier is, if you ever see him in a room with other people that have control of a microphone just for a few minutes, it's always it's that malignant narcissism inside of him that he can't take it. He has to be know all, beat all, end all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't get it, but you know, I had a few introductory psychology classes in college, and one of the first things I learned was don't continue in here if you think you're going to be able to figure out your own problems. And so I went to another course.
That's great. That's great. Oh my God. Well, so on the terms of the people in the most vulnerable jobs, all right, like for example the prison system. I mean, there has to be a tremendous amount of stress. Those folks are probably as close to at least in some areas that the meat packers are in. And I just wonder. I know the meat packers, 2,500 of them didn't decline to return to Tyson Foods on the
in Ohio,
not safe. And
Right.
they're not organized. I understand they're not organized. I hope you know, Brother Trump sending some organizers out to meet those guys.
Yeah,
because they're going to need some help, you know. But
because that is very difficult work, and you know, too many people take for granted what happens to get the food from, you know, to their table, and don't really realize the steps that are involved. You know, we had a big issue with our Federal Service inspection personnel that are part of the USDA, where the Trump administration last fall rolled back the standards so that basically these large meatpacking processing plants are supposed to process. I forget the exact number, so forgive me. I don't want to make one up that will be incorrect. It's somewhere on the order of about 3 times as many per hour. So basically, you know, these inspectors are there watching, you know, hogs, beef, chickens, whatever they're in there to inspect, go by at a rate that's impossible for them to basically do their work. And again, that's because of the so-called rollback of regulations. You know, everybody wants to scream the regulations are bad, and you know, and sometimes they can be frustrating, but the regulations in many cases are there for our safety. You know, the regulations for food inspection, for clean air, clean water, things like that, they're there for our safety. It's that simple, and it's what good government is all about.
Well, most of those laws came into place because, you know, there was a disaster, and so a whole bunch of people, you know, either got sick or killed as a consequence. I remember Love Canal in Buffalo.
Hey, John, what happened to JB?
He came off and on. He'll be back.
Okay.
I assume. And I remember I when I was living in Buffalo in the late '60s, I mean, we used to go up there and you could throw a lit lighter into the river, and it would you would get a beautiful blue flame that would just sort of
Oh boy, oh boy. So,
wow.
So are you guys sister cities then with Cuyahoga? Did you guys have that little program going?
I don't remember. Not then. I don't remember we had a. I wasn't as involved in political.
Right. Because that was the stories too out of there, was that the Cuyahoga River caught fire and it took them a few days to get it put out. Pollution in it.
Well, it was people were putting everything in. We used to, when I was a student, we would go down to South Buffalo and you know, take some things that we shouldn't be taking and watch the slag pour into the Lake Erie when it was covered with ice, and it would turn all this infernal rainbow of colors, right? And it was a magnificent act of pollution that was happening, but it looked like you were in the first circle of purgatory or something like that.
Wow.
But it was something to see. And then, you know, once the Clean Water Act came into effect, it took several years, obviously, but it cleaned up Lake Erie pretty good. You could fish in it again.
Right.
You know, so there is I agree with you. The regulations.
So we've got a lot of problems within the federal system. Number one, the employees that I mentioned right now that are out there that are working, that are on the front lines currently, and especially in the VA, who don't have the proper personal protective equipment. Throughout the Bureau of Prisons, you know, what we're there's going to be a huge demonstration. We're going to obey social distance, but tomorrow from 10 to 6, we're going to be demonstrating against the importing of prisoners from the D.C. jail system. Hazleton has been designated as the D.C. jail system overflow, and they're going to bring people from there. And as I understand, there are quite a number of cases. I've heard a number of over 80 people at the D.C. jail system who've already been tested positive for COVID-19, and yet they want to use Hazleton as a quarantine facility. Now, why don't they just take one of their dormitories there in the DC system, where I understand they're not overcrowded, and quarantine those infected prisoners there instead of transporting them to a new facility that doesn't have it, because you're spreading this disease into an area that thankfully Preston County, West Virginia has been spared from a lot of these COVID problems. Mm-hmm. And so we're deeply concerned about what's going to happen with the Bureau of Prisons and the people at Preston County. As well, we're deeply concerned about what's already happened at Gilmer. They designated the Gilmer prison as another quarantine unit. And so originally they told us these were only going to be brand new intake people who had been sentenced to crimes. And so then the U.S. Marshals were going to transport them over to the prison again with a temperature test and a how have you been feeling lately, calling that a COVID test. But we haven't got our hands on a manifest, but the word we're hearing from our other Bureau of Prisons brothers and sisters is these people are not all new intake prisoners. They've come from all different parts of the federal correctional institution system, and therefore could come from anywhere. And there are several prisons in the nation right now, federal prisons, that have huge COVID outbreaks, real hot spots. Terre Haute, Indiana, Butner, North Carolina, many more that I could come up with that have got, when I last talked with the people at Butner, North Carolina, between inmates and staff, there were over 90 cases of people who had COVID down there. And so, we have got to get whole-scale testing in this country, and whole-scale testing for these frontline employees. It's just that simple. You can't just ask somebody, how have you been feeling, and have you taken a Tylenol lately to keep your fever down? That's not a COVID test.
No.
Paul Romer, Nobel Prize winner, economist, and I guess for a while, one of the chief economic advisors to Obama, came out with a proposal just exactly the same as yours, actually, this past week, saying that rather than all this, never mind all this money that's been spent for liquidity of corporations, and I'm not going to argue that some of that's not necessary. If the banks all fail on us, okay, it is a problem, okay, a serious problem. But he was saying you could take $100 billion, he counted it up, and you could, before the summer's out, you could get the capacity to test as much, enough to be able to accurately trace and quarantine who you need to quarantine and who doesn't need to be quarantined, he says. And that $100 billion would be better spent than some of the other, trillions, actually being spent. And I think that's kind of where you're going in a way. If you don't have the data,
you don't know.
How do you know really what to do? Okay.
And you're blind.
Right.
You're blind. You don't know who has it, who doesn't have it. And until we can get our crap together and figure that out, we're gonna continue to see this thing around and prevalent and still killing people. And that's unfortunate. I mean, I don't yet see, John, you and I have talked about this, JB, you and I have talked about this. We don't yet see at the federal level a real coordinated effort for everything.
No.
You have FEMA stealing masks that were on order to a state.
Right. That's wrong.
That is just baloney.
I saw something on on one of the reports from Germany, and it was just a visual that said so much. How far behind we are. It was on a street corner in a major German city. I think it was Munich, and it was a vending machine for masks. They have these in public places, and it's Nase- and Mund Masken, nose and mouth masks, and you can go to a vending machine and put in a couple of coins and get yourself a mask. How in the hell are we ever going to get to the point where we can get decent masks, not only to all of our workers, but to those of us who are, trying to go around with bandanas? It's almost like that we're in the medieval times. Now, I understand, and all the health people say, that some of these homemade masks and these bandanas are good for us, and it's certainly better than not having something. But we need really good, decent masks, the N95 respirators. And the fact that some countries are having these, and they've got them in vending machines on street corners, good gracious, where are we?
Well, that's a question. Does anybody know? I mean, we should get an expert on here, because there are supply chain issues, and then there are policy and execution issues. It seemed to be a both going on. And if you have a failure of execution at the top level, well, then, you know, you're not going to solve the supply chain problems as easy, right? I mean, you got Trump actually saying, well, I'm going to leave that up to the states. Why he did that and other countries did the opposite is, I think, an execution problem. Okay.
Well, I remember how effective that policy was in World War II. That worked out really well for us, right? Just, you know, we're going to leave it up to the states. Right.
Didn't work.
Well, unfortunately, it makes the states compete with each other. They're all fighting and bidding against each other and driving the price up instead of, you know, the president's attempt to invoke the Defense Act was, in my opinion, woefully inadequate, because all he did was order
meat packers.
He ordered 3M to go ahead and make as many as they wanted to, and gave FEMA the authority to take as many off of 3M as they wanted to. Well, how does that solve the problem? How does that fix the supply chain? Obviously, 3M was not in a position to make enough of these masks to keep up with the supply that we need. So, you know, why aren't you activating somebody else to do that with your presidential powers? I don't get it.
Here's the thing. It seems like everything at the federal level is going through Jared Kushner's office.
Exactly.
And he's cutting deals with some of his buddies in the industry. Mm-hmm. And the idea that, and again, we one of the worst things about Trump is that he tries to think like a businessman running his own business, that the United States of America is his business, and he's going to figure it out for his betterment for his business. And so these supply line issues are all going through Jared, who's on the phone all day long, talking to various people about respirators and ventilators and other things. And then these people that Jared talks to come out on these programs to get these CEOs to march out in front of the president. And then the other supply issue that is so crucial is the food banks. Mm-hmm. We've got crops that are being plowed under. We've got huge waste going on. The Department of Agriculture hasn't figured out how to quit sending food through the regular food chains that go to restaurants and that go to schools and that go to all the places that do need food on a regular basis. Well, they're not there anymore. So now people are lining up for food in food banks. So instead of sending it to schools and restaurants, we send it to food banks. But no, we're plowing those crops under. We're pouring milk down the drain. We're smashing millions of eggs every day. That kind of thing is a federal government issue. You can't expect 50 states to go out and say, I want to buy so many cartons of eggs from some supplier so that we can free distribute them in a food bank. That has to be part of the Defense Production Act. And military, the one thing about World War II and any other war, we know that the military can move goods and services around probably better than anybody. And why the military isn't massively used, those people are already employed by the government. Why aren't they already being used to reinvent this thing? And yet they're not doing it, and we're 4 months into this.
Right.
Now you had,
hold on, guys.
Sorry, John. You even had Governor Cuomo say he was going to purchase milk and eggs rather than have them. He was going to purchase them from the dairy farmers in New York, just to try to get some state distribution to some of his food banks.
Let's pause there. We're about at the hour point here, and of course, if I get to YouTube and Facebook under an hour, they turn off part of their auto grader.
Those bastards.
which is just as well, in case Mike's remark about one of our leaders deemed
what?
They don't censor like that. It'll be okay. But
I have no idea what you're talking about.
It works better if we're under an hour. I want to give everybody a chance to do a short last statement if they would like to close the show. And why don't we start with Dan? Okay.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me. And again, federal employees are on the front line in this COVID crisis. They're doing the best they can. They are unsung heroes, and those heroes deserve to have the safety that they need. They need to have protective equipment. We need to have full-scale testing for people who are going to be returning from working from home into the workplace so that we don't have outbreaks and continuing spread of the COVID-19. And the federal government employees are here to help. We just need the administration to lead the way.
Amen. Dr. Smock. I was going to say Smock.
I want to wish everybody a happy May Day, and especially my wife, since May Day is her birthday. So that the great socialist and international labor holiday. I know we have Labor Day in September, but historically May Day is where it all started with labor. And so happy birthday to my wife. And thanks for having me on today. And I think this kind of conversation is going on all over America right now, and I hope big changes occur.
Thank you, Ray. JB and Mike, any last words?
Yeah, I want to thank our guests for coming on. I apologize for my Wi-Fi mess up, but my son is in the VA. He starts the VA in about 10 days, and I'm very concerned about his PPE, being a nurse. So I'm going to be in touch with Dan quite often to find out why the VA, of all agencies that serve our military, is not providing adequate protection.
Mike, you want to close this up? You want to take us out?
Yeah, I want to just thank Ray and Dan both. Thank you guys for coming on, and happy birthday to Mrs. Schmock. I think that's great. And happy May Day. And I just want to say, look, it as a famous comedian once said, you can't fix stupid, and apparently you're not really going to be able to outrun it either. So,
all right, guys. Okay, thank you guys very much. Okay, and
all right, we'll see you. Have a great day.
We'll be back again in a week at 9 o'clock on Fridays. Thanks, Dan. Thanks,
everyone.
All right,
bye bye.